Okay, good afternoon. My name is Brian Lantz, and we're here for the Saturday meeting. This is already, what, the 18th of November. We had a wonderful Schiller birthday event last Saturday, and I think most people here were participants in that. And for everyone, that's now up on the website, on the Schiller Tech's YouTube website, Schiller Institute Tech's, EX website, and it'll soon be, if it's not already, it'll be up on the National Schiller Institute website, schillerinstitute.org. So that was 4 hours of music, drama, poetry, a tremendous event. Great turnout of people and food and just a lot of enjoyment. So we were celebrating and already then, in part, the summit, which had just occurred, 7th through 9th in particular. President Trump's visit to China, meeting with President Xi Jinping, and of course their delegations. We had 40 or 50 businessmen, depending on who you talk to, that were there with President Trump, that flew in to join him in Beijing. And Helga LaRouche has put out a statement. Americans must discover what really happened on Trump's China trip. Helga LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute. And I really want to, in that light, I really want to point people to the CGTN website. Mike, if you can put that up, where videos from that trip, over 25 videos, are available there. Different aspects of the Trump-Xi visit, the tours, cultural tours, the meetings, discussions, presentations, and so on and so forth are there. And Helga LaRouche had singled out this link on this website, on the Chinese news website, as a place for Americans to go. And she made the point, you don't have to, trust us. You don't have to listen to us and believe what we say. Americans right now have a real responsibility to go out and find out for themselves and assess for themselves in depth what actually occurred in this this 2.5 day, 3 day trip. But keeping in mind that this trip was really, this goes back to Mar-a-Lago, Florida, the meeting there of Xi Jinping and President Trump back in the early stages of the Trump presidency, shortly after President Trump came into office. This has been an ongoing process, and so we have real results from this. But Helga wanted to emphasize the cultural dialogue is an extremely important part of this process. That virtually an entire day of the president's visit to China was spent absorbing, and their itinerary was arranged for this purpose, absorbing Chinese culture. This is a 5,000-year-old civilization. You don't understand it if you think it's communist. If you think, if you're thinking in Cold War logic and rhetoric, you're missing the boat entirely. This was obviously a point that President Xi Jinping and his wife and others were making, was they were saying, okay, here it is. Learn how we think. We are trying to give you insight into our approach to the world, where this win-win approach comes with which China is approaching the world, the Belt and Road Initiative, and otherwise, in other dimensions. Secondly, so definitely take in these videos and kind of read between the lines, so to speak, in terms of the process here at work. This is a new era that's opening up. Helga LaRouche emphasized, and of course she's an expert who's been in and out of China. She's been working at the policy level of collaboration, West and East, China and the West, including the cultural dialogue. So take that in. Another feature of this trip, briefly, is that going forward, this is going to be advanced at the highest level, at the level of the presidents themselves. President Xi Jinping and President Trump have agreed they're going to go forward on this. They're going to be calling the shots. They and select cabinet members are going to be working together. There's 4 tracks that have been set up in terms of economics, security, and so forth issues. Those will go forward, but they'll go forward at the highest level of government. This is, the can is not going to be kicked down the road, so to speak. And lower level operatives are not going to be able to sabotage this process. That's the intention. And they're going to be staying in touch, as they said, on a very regular basis by phone, continued meetings, discussions, trips back and forth. So that's it's very important. Again, this goes to the power of the institution of the presidency. Today's speaker, Evelyn Lantz, is going to be speaking on, as many of you know, on John Quincy Adams, who turned the country on a dime. Really a miraculous process. In a single term, although his role in American history spans decades and decades, but in 4 years of the presidency, changed the whole direction of the country. The power of the presidency, this is the point I'm just trying to make right now. Power of the president is not a prime minister. He doesn't serve at the whim of the members of the parliamentary majority. He has powers given to him, authority given to him under the Constitution, and he can act as other presidents. Key points have acted, as we know from Lincoln, from Roosevelt, and from Kennedy, among others. So going forward, you can see this process beginning to unfold. And finally, I just want to mention $260 billion in agreements, and this can rapidly triple or quadruple in terms of the nature of this. One project, I'll mention 2, but one is the Westinghouse nuclear power plant. You have one going in Xiamen already, supposed to come online later this year, south of Shanghai, but there'll be 5 more. These are Westinghouse AP1000s. These are the most advanced nuclear power plants in the world right now. They shut down, have completely passive safety systems. If all the power to the nuclear power plant was shut down, cut off overnight, the systems could shut down passively, without damage, without leakage, without anything. That's just one feature of it. But these power plants, this is the first AP1000 coming online in the world. You have other countries, India wants 6 of them, other countries, but Westinghouse was on the verge of bankruptcy. It has filed for bankruptcy. Right? So what China is doing, stepping forward here and consolidating a memorandum of understanding and expansion on the original agreement, is essentially salvaging a key capability for the growth of the world economy, and including the United States. The second is, and this has been noted, agreements, not all the details are known, $80 billion plus, $84 billion in agreements for investments into West Virginia, into coal, shale, natural gas, by Chinese companies. This is a state that was left to rot by Obama, by the Greenies, and frankly by the Congress that went along with it. Right? One of the highest opioid addiction rates in the world, in the country, or the world for that matter, per capita, was a consequence of this, of the impoverishment of West Virginia, largely dependent on its coal and related industries, and now they're being given a future back to a capability, potentiality to work and build their own future again. So these are just a couple of examples so far that's spreading optimism, important optimism, including in the United States. And this is why the Anglo-American media, the British orchestrated media that we're dealing with out of London and Wall Street, is absolutely trying to fan this whole deal as if it's not occurring. When in fact, this is multiplying. We know that there's a major trade mission now that's going to be going to China from Houston. This is a similar process going on in the country. Think of Jerry Brown. Jerry Brown, meeting with Xi Jinping, the governor of California, night and day there, I mean, at the if you will, the grassroots level, the city, state level. Bill Jones was making this point last night in the webcast. They want, they want jobs, they want trade, they want collaboration. They're not listening to the ideologues, neocon and R2P crowd and whatever in Washington that's trying to stand in the way of this. So it's moving forward now. So just to finish up on this, well, there's a lot of groping going on. We're hearing about it every day. Why are we hearing about it? We're hearing about this as opposed to what's really going on. But I would just say, look, the real groping is going on is that the British Anglo-American crowd don't know what they're doing. They're groping right now in the dark, and this is. We should make fun of it. I mean, this is just absurd because there is a real process. There is a real directionality. We play this critical role. Helga and Lyndon LaRouche have played this critical role and an outcome now is shaping up for going forward. So I think I'll just leave it there. There's more that could be said. There's much more going on in the world. There's also much more important to get the historical context because we've got to bring America forward now. The America of Hamilton, John Quincy Adams, Lincoln, FDR. We got to bring that to the table to work with China. So with that, I'd like to invite our scholar, our expert on Quincy Adams. Possesses one of the largest libraries in the world of Quincy Adams works. Anyway, I will do you here a little bit, but I'll introduce. Let me introduce Evelyn Lantz.
I only spent our food budget last month. No, I think when I introduce you a little bit more, I'm sure all of you know some about John Quincy Adams, but when you come to know him better, he's a dear friend of mine. You will understand the panic on the part of the British over the potential for the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, under the influence of Lyndon LaRouche. Because there's a myth out there that almost everybody, consciously or unconsciously, has bought into, which is that the United States just sort of smoothly developed from an undeveloped frontier to an industrial nation. Nothing could be further from the truth. The battle waging between two factions, the Alexander Hamilton faction, whose policies made the country great, and the British faction that kept pushing the country backwards into stagnation. Now, there were great advances under President George Washington and Hamilton for the first decade or so of the existence of the constitutional republic. But then you had, starting with the presidency of Thomas Jefferson in 1801, 25 years of stagnation and backwardness. And this began with the closing of the National Bank in 1811. Generally, Hamilton's policies were being overturned. The War of 1812, which was, of course, the second war between America and the British Empire, had a shock effect on the country. Even the capital of Washington, D.C. was burned by the British. Now, the population was shocked into realizing we had to have a different policy. The country could not survive without a shift in policy. But that required leadership. And there really was not the leadership available to make that change at that point. The United States had virtually no infrastructure. If you think about, the worst of third world countries today, that's what you had. You had a few cities on the coast. They had a few roads connecting them. You could get to the west on a horse over, over the mountains. You could get, if you were in the Ohio, the part, west of the Appalachians, you could get to the East Coast by somehow getting to the Ohio River, going down the rapids, getting to the Mississippi, going down the Mississippi, with some kind of conveyance, getting to New Orleans, getting a ship, getting a boat to get to the East Coast. That was the United States in the first couple of decades of the 1800s, the 19th century. There were little coal stove, charcoal stove foundries for iron that were huddled in rural woods. They had to be next to a supply of charcoal because they were using a huge amounts of wood to create the charcoal, to create some iron. And a shocking fact is that we were producing less iron in the United States in the first couple of decades of the 1800s than we had 150 years earlier. The British had shut down iron manufacturing in 1750. Now, John Quincy Adams had long fought to change this policy. In 1806, he was a United States Senator from Massachusetts. And in fact, if you read John Kennedy's profile in Courage, he's the first profile in Courage. And I would encourage people to do that if you haven't. And he introduced a resolution calling for the Treasury Department to issue a plan for internal improvements, to build canals and roads to develop the West as a national project of the United States. This, of course, is John Quincy Adams when he was younger. Within a few weeks, another senator offered an identical resolution, and the Treasury Department was ordered to draw up such a plan. There's only one problem. The president was Thomas Jefferson, the Treasury Secretary was Albert Gallatin, and nothing ever happened. The project was never brought into effect. Quincy Adams continued to fight for these policies. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, and that's a whole story in itself, which if people are interested, I can tell you more. But he became the Secretary of State, but it was not until he became president that he had the power to actually carry out the policies to begin the industrialization of the United States. It began the greatest growth in our history. Period starting 1825 to 1829, and then what continued despite the sabotage is the greatest growth in American history. One of his key allies was a man named Nicholas Biddle, who was the third president of the Second National Bank of the United States. Now, I'm going to go through the stunning accomplishments of Adams, but I want to go back to something else briefly first, which is LaRouche's 4 laws. You may have noticed that LaRouche always says these are not 4 separate pieces of, these are not 4 separate policies. You can't separate them. This is a whole. And that if you try to do one piece, whether it's Glass-Steagall or National Bank or whatever, by itself, it probably will not work. Definitely will not work. And if you look at the history of the Second National Bank, that's what you see. Does anybody know when the Second National Bank was established? Question. Yes. 1516. That's correct. Now, the problem was you had what it should have done is resume the existence of a national currency and a credit system to facilitate a national development policy. They were faced with tremendous problems. There were a whole army of unregulated state banks that had grown up in a time when there was no national bank. The government had taken out a loan for the war at 20% interest. The currency rates were fluctuating so much that they ended up paying it back at a currency that was worth twice as much as what had been taken out. So you needed somebody like Alexander Hamilton, who had a national overview, an idea of what the policy should be, and the chutzpah to carry it out. And instead, got something very different. Now, the first president his name was William Jones. And I don't think he's any relation to our, Bill Jones as far as I know, but that was his name. He was basically totally unqualified. He was put in there for political reasons. He wanted to silence the objections of the speculators against the national bank. So he supplanted the state bank bubble. It was one of the reasons they set up a national bank, because they had this bubble in the state banks. He simply supplanted that with loans from regional branches with no relation to capital in the national bank or without any kind of limit. You had a gigantic bubble developing. Finally, some of the other directors of the bank began to exert their influence in 1818. They forced curtailments of the loans, but that put pressure on merchants as well as speculators and led to mass bankruptcy. So the bank was overextended. So I want to make sure excuse me. I want to make sure I got the right guy. Bank was overextended. It was drained of much of its species, that is, its gold and silver. And this whole question of use of gold and silver is something that confuses a lot of Americans today, because if you simply use gold and silver, you're not going to have an expansionary credit policy to allow you to expand your real economy. In 1819, January, President Monroe appointed a new director, a new president. His name was Lyndon. Now, he wanted to rein in the speculation. So he took various measures to rein in the speculation, unfortunately, including suspending the part of the bank charter that said that all notes given out by the bank and its branches would be receivable at any branch. That part of the charter made the banknote there it is, into a virtual national currency. He suspended that, so he did not have a national currency. Then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams wrote on April 5th, 1819, quote, "The bank is so drained of its species, it is hardly conceivable that they can go to the month of June without stopping payment." He attacked the measure that Cheves took to refuse to receive payments in public account on the branches of, from all the branches. So Adams knew what needed to be done. He didn't have the power to do it. Cheves' action burst the speculative bubble, but it created all kinds of other, difficulties. You had legitimate businessmen who had gone back had established their businesses as far back as the first national bank in the 1790s and the first decade. They were bankrupted out with this tight, you might call it tight money policy. They canceled loans, canceled bills of exchange. There was a reduction of business activity. Manufacturers were, having to discharge workers because they weren't able to pay wages. And perhaps worst of all, Cheves firmly believed, that is the second president of the Second National Bank, that the only way to resume issuance of notes at all branches would be to hold more specie, more gold and silver, than the amount of notes being issued. This is a guarantee for a non-growing economy. And John Quincy Adams continued to discuss this with his fellow cabinet members. He said, I also had some conversation with Treasury Secretary Crawford on the present situation and prospects of the country, which are alarming. The banking bubbles are breaking. The staple productions of the soil constituting our principal articles of export are falling to half and less than half the prices they have lately borne. The merchants are crumbling to ruin. The manufacturers perishing, agriculture stagnating, and the distress universal in every part of the country. So this is 1819. Now, in 1823, in January, Nicholas Biddle was voted in as the president of the bank. He had a very different intention than the two previous presidents. And he had a legacy of pushing for internal improvements when he was a state legislator. He had promoted technological agriculture, and he had fully internalized Hamilton's concept of the bank. So he came in ready to enact the changes to create a national currency. Within 2 years, the currency of the country had been brought under control, you actually had a national currency and now a national credit policy. Now all that was needed was a president who had the policies to utilize that capability. And in March of 1825, John Quincy Adams became president of the United States, and the greatest period of growth in our nation's history ensued. So let me give you just a little bit of an overview of what he did in this intense period. First of all, canals and roads were pushed through, opening up the West to settlement. So we could also, back. Thank you. So that we could also bring the coal to the new settlements and created an entirely new Midwestern centers of industry. The new industry under tariff protection was reborn, that is the iron industry. Railroads began military design construction and quickly grew from nothing to thousands of miles. Financing and planning of these enterprises was coordinated by federal, military, state, and local authorities. Bank of the United States drove the program forward with credit regulations that throttled down parasitical and speculation and directed public and private investment funds into infrastructure and industry. Now, think about LaRouche's proposal, the 4 laws. What does he actually say the whole thing comes, the start of the 4 laws for LaRouche is ironically the 4th law, the science driver of the fusion energy and the space program. And Quincy Adams organized his program exactly the same way. And the science driver at that time was railroads. When Quincy Adams came in, there were no railroads. There were no tracks, no railroads, no rail engines, no rail cars, no nothing. There were no railroads. And he very rapidly began a program for development of that new platform, the railroads. He assigned the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at West Point to make surveys of the plans and designs for the railroads. Eventually, 60 such railroads were planned in that way. You have the other one of that Mohawk? No, back?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
This is 1826 when one of them was planned. It wasn't the very first, but there were all kinds of railroads that began to be planned under government and army, leadership to make it possible. The first actual railroad was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was chartered in 1827. Adams assigned Army engineers to this project. They were privately owned companies financed by the government. They got their money from state governments, from city governments, and federal land grants, which was later. Now, this gentleman, Charles Carroll, is a very interesting guy. He was the guy who laid the cornerstone for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad on July 4th, 1828, to create the first functioning railroad in the United States. He also was the last living signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was also apparently the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He also, interestingly, was a co-founder of both the first and second national banks of the United States. And he also became one of the directors of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal. He was quite a very amazing man. Charles Carroll, C-A-R-R-O-L-L. And when he laid the first stone, this was his quote: "I consider this among the most important acts of my life, second only to my signing the Declaration of Independence." And the first section of the railroad from Baltimore's west to Ellicott's Mills, which is currently now known as Ellicott City, glad we don't have Joe here to tell you for sure, was opened on May 24th, 1830, and included a bridge named after Charles Carroll, known as the Carrollton Viaduct. Now this thing is amazing. This was finished in 1829. It's made out of granite, and it is one of the world's oldest railroad bridges still in use for rail traffic in Baltimore. It is being used to this day, and they certainly did not imagine the kinds of weight, that it was carrying it is carrying now, but it's still in use. So that's the kind of thing that was being built under John Quincy Adams. Under the authority of the 1824 General Survey Act, President Adams assigned Army engineers to work with the new privately owned railway companies. Military men surveyed and designed the routes for the nation's first 60 or so railroads. And you can see huge number of railroads, that were developed under, this was under Adams' policy. Even after he was there, the policy was continued. The West Point Foundry turned out the first American locomotives. They built something called this is not either of any of the ones I'm describing, but this is the kind of engine that you had at the time. They built the Best Friend of Charleston and West Point. These are the names of two engines they built for the South Carolina Railroad and Canal Company, which was chartered in 1827, and the DeWitt Clinton for the Mohawk and Hudson Railroad, chartered in 1826. That's when you saw the sign referring to it. Now here's something very important for Americans to know. State and local governments provided more than half of the overall capital invested in early American railways. How much do you think the New York stock market supplied? 0. Yep. Not a dime. Most private capital came from small investors, from merchants, from local manufacturers, from farmers and tradesmen, people along the route of the proposed railroads. Now, the New York stock market finally bought in at the point where they bought in order to use the railroads as a basis for speculation, not for actually, using them as railroads. And it's very interesting because this was still the case when Jesse Jones was there under Franklin Roosevelt, when the railroads were in financial trouble and they came to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation for loans. Jones said, where is your railroad? Oh, New Orleans, Louisiana. Where do you live? New York. So he said, you can have a loan if you move to where your railroad is. They moved and they got their loan. Now, this is as of 1835. You can see, there's not a lot, but, from 1825, when John Quincy Adams came in 1830, when the first one actually started operation, it's a pretty good, start with some railroads. Then, the next thing, it's not consecutive because the canals were built first, but as part of building up the infrastructure, canals played a very critical role. In July of 1825, as the New York's Erie Canal was nearing completion, the governor who had pushed that through, DeWitt Clinton from New York, was in Ohio. He was joining that state's leaders in breaking ground for two great canal projects that would complete the first water route from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. Now think of what I said earlier. How did you get, if you were on the East Coast, how did you get into this area? You had to go by horseback. If you were in this area and you wanted to get back to the East Coast, you had to find your way somehow down the Ohio, get to the Ohio, go down the Ohio. There was no simple way to do it. These canal systems linked everything up in terms of both population being able to travel, but industrial goods, especially including coal. I'll just mention the Ohio and Erie Canal cut south from Lake Erie to the eastern section of the state, to the Ohio River. And that gave birth to the cities of Cleveland and Columbus. The Miami Canal connected the Ohio River at Cincinnati with the western end of Lake Erie, creating the city of Toledo. John Jammer's hometown?
Right.
So that's how it got there. The John Quincy Adams administration, there are all kinds of other, canals, the Ohio and Erie, the Ohio, I'll go through them in a second. In any case, the John Quincy Adams administration put through Congress an allotment of hundreds of thousands of acres of land for sale to aid in financing these canals. You can see on this chart. This is 1827. This is John Quincy Adams. This is 1823, before John Quincy Adams. A little bit of land for, you know, a few roads. Now, that, you know, there was land allotted for so they could sell it. People have heard about this, which is railroads later on. You know, there were land grants, and that allowed, you know, for the financing of the rail building. But the canal is the same thing. And as I said, the engineering board under General Bernard, who was from the Army Corps of Engineers, surveyed routes for Ohio's Erie Canal, the Dismal Swamp Canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the Allegheny and Susquehanna Canal, the Susquehanna and Schuylkill, Delaware and Raritan, Buzzards Bay, Barnstable and the Narragansett, and Boston Harbor canals. In other words, canals all over the country. President John Quincy Adams was the speaker at the 1828 dedication commencing the federal construction of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which went from Washington, D.C. to the Ohio River. And President Adams turned the first spade of earth and reminded celebrants, quote, "The Lord of the universe said unto them, be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. We perform his will in the subjugation of the earth for the improvement of the condition of man." New Jersey also chartered the vital Morris Canal, which had been projected in 1820. The Bank of the United States undertook sponsorship as a national priority, seeing the canal through to epoch-making success. The Morris Canal traversed the state of New Jersey from the Delaware River across Pennsylvania's coal mining country, up through Newark to Jersey City on the Hudson, across from Manhattan. Cheap coal steamed into the shops of New Jersey's industrial urban corridor that was built up on the canal banks. The cheap fuel poured into New York City, whose real wealth came as a giant manufacturing hub. Iron ore from northern New Jersey was delivered in return to Ohio's booming iron foundries. So between the canals and the rail lines,
Right.
yeah. Can I explain what? Yeah, this is the cost to ship 1 ton, 300 miles. So with wagons between 1800 and 1818, it was, what, about $90. Then, you know, by 1817, I assume still mainly using wagons, it was about $50. But then, with the building of the canals between the 1830s and the 1850s, you're down to, what's that, about 5?
8 or 9, something.
And then, you know, with the railroads. You know, and this is the kind of thing that, you know, when we're talking about infrastructure now, and they want to know what they want, these hedge funds want to be able to have something that's going to pay back immediately, and, you know, give them a toll or something, so they, you know, they don't think about how it affects the overall economy. Build the infrastructure. It completely transforms the economy, as this shows. Now, the state of Pennsylvania, with key role of Nicholas Biddle, invested millions of dollars beginning in 1825 for a system of canals connecting the coal mining regions and the cities with the Atlantic ports. So you can see they built this, you know, because you're dealing, what does Pennsylvania become known for? Coal and iron. And without this network, first of canals and later of railroads, that wouldn't have been possible. And much of the industrialization of the United States wouldn't have been possible. For this one?
Yeah.
I do not know for sure. You know, Mike, you got the book.
Well, it's you know, it's in the early 1830s, probably like 1830s. About the time that shortly after before the Civil War.
So they built up canals linking western Pennsylvania. Over here is Ohio. Notably Pittsburgh, to the new agro-industrial powerhouse in Ohio. In later years, the Bank of the U.S. sponsored the creation of the Reading Railroad. The bank owned a fourth of the stock. and its special purpose was transporting anthracite coal to market. So the American coal mining industry began as a direct result of these projects. It did not exist, like the railroads, didn't have a coal mining industry, until these projects were being carried out. Commercial production of anthracite coal rose from 409 tons in 1820 to 215,000 tons in 1830. So this was from a non-existent industry, to a major industry, and soon after that to millions of tons. Anthracite coal.
Hard coal.
Later, bituminous coal flourished after they developed technology for using it in steel and iron manufacturing. But during this period, this was hard coal. And interestingly, a talented young German economist named Friedrich List, who had been imprisoned in Europe under the British Habsburg domination, came to Pennsylvania in 1825. He helped develop the coal mines, studied and worked with Carey and Biddle on tariff and financial strategy. And then he returned to Europe. And, remember when Trump was elected, then said, this is not an American victory, this is an international victory, this is world change. And that's what was being created also by what John Quincy Adams did. As Friedrich List, going back to Germany, he created Germany's first railroad. He successfully joined the German states in a tariff union, which was the first step to nationhood for Germany. And then his published works on the American system of economics inspired nationalists in Ireland, Germany, Russia, Japan, India, Mexico, and South America. They, because of it, rebelled against the imperial British free trade policies, which would otherwise condemn them to eternal backwardness. And according to Helga LaRouche, the most read economist in China today is Friedrich. So this is history, but not, dead history for sure. So you have the development of the railroads as a science driver, the canals to supplement that, the coal industry, which made possible the development of the iron industry. Benjamin Franklin and his, remember a class Brian gave some time ago, right? The United States was producing iron with the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1600s. But, and then Benjamin Franklin and his junto had nurtured foundries in colonial Pennsylvania. However, in 1750, the British Iron Act prohibited foundries. So basically, they shut down the production of iron, for the most part, in the United States. And given the policies in the early 1800s, not much happened. Even with the War of 1812, which created some potential, but then the 1890 tight moneys policy collapsed anything that was there. However, that changed. The government encouragement and then tariffs protection between 1824 and 1828, national iron production rose in a not quite as dramatically as coal, but pretty dramatically. It was 20,000 tons in 1820. It was 200,000 tons by 1832. So you had these little, went from this. As Mike Carr said, well, actually, when that was, there probably, at the point that it was operating, there weren't any trees around it because they had to cut them all. Because they had to cut them all down to get the charcoal, to run the iron foundry. And you had 200 bushels of, it would take 200 bushels of charcoal costing $10 to produce a ton of raw pig iron. However, 2 tons of anthracite coal costing half that much, $5, could potentially produce the same amount of iron. So you had the Franklin Institute offering gold medals to the manufacturer of the greatest amount of iron made with anthracite. So you had private as well as the government promoting this kind of policy. A $5,000 prize for anthracite iron was offered personally by Nicholas Biddle's publisher, Isaac Lee. And you had the development of a gigantic iron industry. And if you think about, the United States as an industrial power, this was absolutely critical for doing that. So overall, the credit of the U.S. was good, internally and abroad, because the government based its loans and investments on the credit to provide physically productive enterprises, to create more future real wealth than was expended to build them. Now, this is just a chart of some of the investments and loans of the Bank of the United States. There's a lot, as it says down here, the Pennsylvania investments are large because the bank was once again shut down, and then it was stopped from functioning before it was officially shut down, and it continued to carry out loans in Pennsylvania. But there are all kinds of things. You have the railroads, canals, coal, other, of various sorts. And everyone prized the debt. In other words, you had a national currency. And people wanted to have the debt of the United States, the notes, the currency of the United States, because the system of self-government based on progress and improvement of the population was obviously the most stable possible, and it created the most stable currency possible. Now, all of this was done between 1825 and 1829. And this is, we didn't just get a rotten press this century, if you hadn't noticed. A rotten press attacked both the National Bank and Adams and resulted in the election of a great war hero, quote unquote, by the name of Andrew Jackson to the presidency, and he became the president in 1829. He began to immediately cripple the National Bank, then he shut it down completely, and began to destroy the economy that the American nationalists had created. However, the nationalists did not give up. A 22-year-old man by the name of Abraham Lincoln ran for Illinois state legislature in 1831. And people have heard, he said, "My program is short like an old lady's dance. I stand for support of the Bank of the United States, internal improvements, and protective tariffs." In 1832, the next year, the 65-year-old John Quincy Adams, the former president, ran for Congress. As far as I know, he's the only former president that ever actually, became part of the U.S. Congress. He ran for Congress and he was elected. Then in 1840, Lincoln and other opponents of Jackson campaigned for William Henry Harrison for president. The population, somewhat like the election of Trump, they were disgusted with the Depression and policies that were destroying them in the country. So they elected William Henry Harrison over Martin Van Buren, the president who had succeeded and controlled Andrew Jackson. Unfortunately, Harrison, who had intended to immediately move to restore the Bank of the United States, died a rather mysterious death, you might say, shortly after his inauguration.
None of the bad presidents ever died at all.
And as usual, his vice president was a rotten, pro-British guy who, when Congress still tried to put through a rechartering of the Bank of the United States, he vetoed it. So it would take the election of Lincoln as president in a crisis of national survival for the country called the Civil War to finally find the political circumstances to retake national control over the U.S. currency, something called the greenback policy. And he not only won the war, but built the Transcontinental Railroad and developed the industry of the nation. We're now at a point where Lyndon LaRouche and his policies are on the edge of bringing back this policy in alliance with the largest nations on the planet, China, Russia, and others, so that instead of the back and forth battle between the American system and the British system, we can win this battle for the American system and have a whole new era for mankind where this kind of progress is not the unique kind of aberration of a few years, but the policy of mankind for the next 100 years. So we can take questions either on political situation or John Quincy? Yeah, Mark.
I was thinking more of present-day concerns. We have President Trump who's committed to this policy that relations and scientific progress and all these things. But his running mate is somebody I don't know much about, and his commitment to, and I really, I have no sense of. And we know from history, William Henry Harrison and FK and the odds are very good of President Trump walking into the public. So his immediate successor is a concern of mine.
Well, I think that President Trump is quite clear on the fact that, his enemies would like him killed. And as far as I understand, he's not only got Secret Service protection, but he brought in some of his own private security. So, if it's possible, to be protected against such things. And the second part of that is what we've done with the Mueller dossier. If you pin the bloody shirt on the door of the murderer before they can carry out a murder, then you do a lot to limit their capability to carry it out. And one of the things that's happened in this fight, because of the way we've carried it out, with LaRouche's focus on a flank that would actually change the whole situation, is suddenly the British are in a position they never wanted to be in, at least since the War of 1812 probably, which is they're the open enemy of the United States. Who was the author of the dodgy dossier on which this whole assault on President Trump has been carried out? Christopher Steele. Who came over and brought his report to John Brennan, the head of the CIA? Hannigan, the head of the GCHQ, the NSA equivalent in Britain. Now the Guardian newspaper has come out saying, well, the details. He not only, this guy Steele not only, did the report on Trump, but he did reports on Ukraine. He's done reports on this and that, and so basically it reminds me of Henry Kissinger saying, well, when I was Secretary of State, I briefed the British Foreign Office before I briefed the State Department and the President. And Christopher Steele is now, and they had to publicly put that out in the London Guardian newspaper in order to try to prop up his credibility as somebody who wasn't just a guy who put out this completely report. So they're out in the open quite a bit. Vladimir, did you have a question?
You say the railroad, were there railroads prevalent in other countries?
I don't know. I do know that in looking at this first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, and this Carrollton Viaduct, he said that it was the second oldest continual use railroad bridge after one in England, which was completed in something like 1824-25. So, and I know also that part of the Pennsylvania networks around Biddle and Matthew Carey sent basically an industrial spy over to England to get some information on what kind of developments were going on there and bring it back. And he put out a whole handbook of various ways for coal mining, I think on railroad, steel building.
Steel making.
I don't think they started steel making that early, did they?
Iron making.
Iron making.
They had a lot of railroads in England and various mining stations powered by gravity from the mine down to the port, and then forces back up because it limited the amount of friction. Yeah, there was a lot of, that was the canal building and the work leading into the development of the steam engine. But for a long time, there were no steam, but they still had no steam engine.
And the question has been raised, that the United States got set up for the War of 1812. We should not have gotten into it because it John Quincy Adams, before the War of 1812, was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. He was working to get Fulton steam engines brought into Russia and set up steam-powered, basically shipping on the rivers in Russia. But the War of 1812, among other things, ended up breaking up the U.S. relationship with Russia. And therefore, at a moment where there was a potential for a real alliance between the U.S. and Russia for industrial development, the U.S. got involved in this war, which we could have kept out of. But by being caught in the trap of during the War of 1812, then it gave the British an excuse to attack us. It stopped our, and it put us into a conflict with Russia, generally. And as you can see, it didn't. People say, well, you got industry and economy booms in the war. Well, yeah, they built a few, production facilities for the war. But as soon as the war was over, the economic policy was so wrong that no bank or a mismanaged national bank of the U.S. that everything collapsed right after it was ended.
Could you say something about the evolution of John Quincy Adams before he became president? In particular, what was Monroe was an evolution of Jefferson and Madison before, and Quincy Adams became the Secretary of State for Monroe, was the author of the Monroe Doctrine. But how did Quincy Adams, who was the penultimate better part of the Federalist Party, become a second figure in that administration?
Because he broke with the Federalist Party when he got thrown out of the Senate. When he was the United States Senator. Yeah, he voted for the Louisiana Purchase, which the Federalist Party. Remember, Washington warned against parties. And even at the very beginning of the nation, you had the Federalist Party becoming, the party of certain pro-British networks inside New England. And so you had pro-British slave party in Virginia, and you had a pro-British, party in New England. Yeah, when you're supposed to choose between which one, the Democratic Party of Jefferson and Virginia and the slaveholders, or the Federalist Party of, the New England, Boston merchant bankers, and their pro-British policy. And like I said, John Kennedy talks about John Quincy Adams as the very first person in his profiles of courage, and he voted for the Louisiana Purchase that Jefferson made, even though the Federalists were totally opposed to it.
And then they kicked him out at that early period.
Yeah, they basically, appointed a new senator, and because at that point it was legislature.
Right.
Appointed the senators. So I don't think he had that much to do with the Federalist Party after that point. I mean, he was a little bit like Trump in the sense that he was a man without a party. He was a man who represented policies that the nation needed, but didn't come in with a whole network of people from.
Well, he didn't have political office.
He was, like I said, he was a ambassador, to England. He was an ambassador to Holland. He was the ambassador. Well, but also under Jefferson. He was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, Prussia, and then Russia, so he held a number of, political offices under different presidents. Remember, he was born in 1767. So he was 9 years old at the point of the American Declaration of Independence. So he went to Europe with his father. He was the guy who knew enough. He was in Russia, I guess he was French. French. So he could, in Russia. So he could, so he was, when he was a teenager, sent to Russia with the envoy from America who was sent there so that he could help interpret and help him. So from the moment he was I mean, you think about LaRouche saying when he was 14, he started deciding, studying Leibniz and other thinkers to decide, what the truth was for himself and figure out a philosophy that worked. John Quincy Adams is a very similar kind of person. And, right. Yeah, he worked under Ben Franklin in Paris for a long time. And he called for another, kind of science writer project that he had, as you probably know, was what he called lighthouses in the sky, which was the observatories. He did his own study of weights and measures. I don't know how many languages, billions of languages. Yeah. Yeah, he was a real genius. Yeah.
That was
Told me that Robert.
We learned that Robert E. Lee was
Mike, why don't we turn the recording off? And then let me just show a short thing